Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. You're all very welcome on behalf of Men Engage Alliance to today's Ubuntu Symposium session on hijacking gender, backlash in policy and practice. I'll pass you over to Jurker. Thank you.
Okay, can we have the slide with the series, the order of the series, that one? Yes, thank you. So I'm Jörg Rydström, a research fellow at IDS, Institute of Development Studies, and co-hosting this series with Men Engage on countering patriarchal backlash and reclaiming gender justice. So this is a series of 5 sessions, and we're right in the middle of the series. The first session was called Understanding the Global Tide of Patriarchal Backlash. Perhaps some of you were there. We had a fascinating discussion looking at the big picture, broad sweeps in terms of regional differences, issues of ethno-nationalism in India and Sweden versus issues of race and colonialism in the US or Uganda. And then we had Denise Kanioti and Sonia Correa talking about the long historical sweep of the kind of conservative religious forces entering politics. So the long sweep of the kind of project of backlash. The second session, which was in February, we looked at body politics and sexual reproductive health and rights, as well as online misogyny, as 2 areas, 2 domains, in which backlash is sort of playing out, to get to a little bit more nuanced reality of the dynamics. I won't go into any more description of that, but now we're halfway through and looking at what we call hijacking gender, backlash in policy and practice, which is essentially a set of conversations about anti-feminist backlash and co-option within policy spaces, processes of policy, and what the implications are for feminist activists and gender justice advocates. Then there are 2 more sessions left in the series, an interactive workshop in May and a closing session, a kind of a more wrapping up session, ways forward, on the 1st of June. So if I could have the slide with the questions for today. We have some, so these are the types of questions we're going to address. How does backlash operate in policy and practice on gender justice and gender equality, both at national and global levels? And how do different types of policy approaches or frameworks restrain or enable backlash in these policy processes? What do backlash machinations in these policy spaces, such as international conferences or the Commission of Status of Women, for example, what does it feel like? What does it look like? And how do progressive actors and development agencies experience these realities of policy co-option and backlash at the international level? What are the resulting tensions, trade-offs, and tactics coming out of that? So then finally, implications from this. What are the implications for policy and practice on engaging men for gender equality? So those are the questions. And Sinead, if I could have this slide, thank you very much. This is more or less, this is the structure of the session, the 2 hours we have. I will try and, Sinead and I will try and wrap up within the first 15 minutes, and we're doing okay so far. And we're setting the stage for the session. I'm going to introduce the speakers, but I will also explain how the session will work. Here, we will, after my introductions, we'll go into the first part, which is looking at how policy frameworks and approaches are either enabling or restraining backlash at the national level, more or less. And we have 3 speakers on that, followed by an interactive discussion, all of which will take about 35 minutes or so. Then we have a midway provocation. Sorry, I'll go through the structure first and then introduce the speakers. Yeah, then we have a midway provocation from Andrea Cornwall, as it happens, about participant observations in policy spaces. This question of what it feels and looks like. And then the second part of this session, after the first hour, we'll be going upwards in the kind of global policy scales, if you like, hearing from SIDA in Sweden about, from a bilateral perspective, this question about how development agencies experience policy corruption and backlash. What is it like from a bilateral perspective? An agency with an international, with a feminist international development policy. There are a few, but SIDA is a good case study in that. Then we have perspective from UN Women, who are, of course, generating data, commissioning data, and keeping an eye and validating data for us to turn to in terms of advocacy and so on. And how does it play out at that level? Again, there will be an interactive conversation between Lena and Laura, and I'll asking them some questions. At the final half hour, we hope we have half an hour left for a plenary discussion, which, depending on how many participants are here and so on, we might have a quick bus breakout rooms for 5 minutes to get that started. But Sinead and I will come back to that at that point, looking at how much time we have left and how many people are here. So let me then quickly introduce the speakers. I'll start with Andrea Cornwall, who is billed as my co-chair. And the reason for that is that she will be chairing the plenary discussion at the end as well. Now, we have put Andrea in the middle of this program, which is because structurally, I feel that her talk will kind of bridge the national level discussions with what's going on at the global level and the global policy spaces. So that's the logic for that. So let me start with Andrea, who is a pro-director for research and enterprise, as well as professor of global development and anthropology at SOA, School of Oriental and African Studies in London. She has a background as a political anthropologist and has worked for many years on issues of inclusions and rights, citizen engagement and gender justice, as well as sexual rights, including with domestic workers, sex workers, movements for those women and people, I should say, in Brazil and India. And she has a longer history of her work in sexual and reproductive health and rights and participation and accountability from Zimbabwe, Nigeria, the UK, and Brazil. So, of course, she also has experience on contestations over gender, empowerment and rights in international policy arenas. I could add that Andrea was the director or convener of the Pathways to Women's Empowerment Network a few years back, quite an interesting and influential network. Then we have Eamon Mwine, or Eamon Ashaba Mwine. Forgive me if I pronounced that wrong. Eamon is assistant professor at the School of Women and Gender Studies at Makerere University, I believe, connected with the Center for Basic Research. And he graduated with MA in Gender Studies in 2011, but also completed his PhD at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, where he focused on the question of men in parliament while interrogating the legislative systems that produce gender, power, and privilege in politics. So very much on topic in terms of what he will speak on later. Then we have Sudarshana Kundu from Gender at Work in India. Sudarshana has an MPA, Master of Public Administration from Columbia University, as well as an MBA in Human Resource Management from the Xavier School of Management in India. She's now co-executive director of Gender at Work globally, but is also the country director for Gender at Work India. So she's been working with a range of organizations driving international change for advancing gender equality and women's rights, or women's empowerment, if you like. In addition, she's also worked with UN Women programs on gender and governance, and with civil society organizations across the globe, and advised numerous public and private sector organizations on strategies for stronger positive social and economic impacts, particularly on gender equality. I mentioned that last point because she will be talking a bit about both private sector and civil society in her talk, her provocation. Then we have Tessa Lewin, a close colleague of mine, research fellow at IDS, who is a development professional for the last 20 years or more, working on participatory action research in particular, both as a researcher and as a visual practitioner. Tessa also has extensive experience in project management and was in fact included in the network of Pathways to Women's Empowerment I mentioned earlier as one example. But she's now the co-leader for our strand on research, for research on policy and practice in this 5-year collaborative program, Countering Backlash, Reclaiming Gender Justice, a collaborative with 10 partners, including Gender at Work and CBR as it happens. Now, I'll move on to Lena Carlson. Lena Carlson is a senior policy specialist in gender equality at SIDA, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, which is obviously based in Stockholm, as most people know. She's herself a business economist with a master's in aid and development, significant experience with women's and children's rights, a career of over 30 years, or approximately 30 years, progressive, responsible positions in Europe, Asia, and Africa, with UN agencies like UNICEF, UN Women, and ILO, as well as with international NGOs over a range of issues. Now, so before joining SIDA, Lena was program manager for the UN Women, Men and Women for Gender Equality program in the Middle East and North Africa region, which is nice because it kind of broadens our regional connections here. Then I'll turn to Laura Turkett from UN Women, who has previously worked both at ActionAid UK and the Institute of Development Studies and the Fawcett Society in the UK. But Laura has, for over a decade now, worked with UN Women and leading their research and data initiatives that inform the organization's advocacy objectives and empower civil society and governments to seek and implement positive social change. So at UN Women, she leads the organization's flagship report, for example, the Progress for the World's Women. Recent issues, or not so recent in some cases, for example, women's access to justice in 2011, economic and social rights in 2015, so very multidimensional. But then a more recent report on families in a changing world, 2019, which is very topical to this discussion on backlash and the issue of traditional families. Laura is also currently leading the development of a feminist plan for sustainability, social justice, to highlight the transformative policies we will need in terms of dealing with the fallout of COVID. I mean, I think many people have heard of the disproportionate impacts of women of COVID, from increased gender-based sexual and gender-based violence, from increased food, job insecurity and job losses, to increased burden of unpaid care, with very likely knock-on effects in terms of girls' schooling as things open up, and possibly early marriage and other problems. But finally, a final point here is that Laura is, of course, also the co-founder of the UN Feminist Network, which is good to know. So those are our esteemed and amazing panel. And without further ado, I should, just under 15 minutes in, we're right on time. I will now then hand over for the first discussion on how our policy frameworks and approaches restraining or enabling backlash in countries. And we'll begin with some words from Eamon Moine. Each of the speakers will take about 5 to 7 minutes each, followed by a discussion between the three of you. So over to Eamon. Can we hear from you?
Thank you so much, Yaka, for that generous introduction. I will right away start on the reflection of how backlash operates in policy and practice in the Ugandan context. I want to pick up on the policy processes, the brief history that we've had, particularly looking back to 1990s when we had constitutional review process, a highly engaging process that saw a vibrant women's rights movement participate in the crafting of the 1995 Constitution, in which discrimination on the basis of sex was outlawed, but also women named as citizens of an equal worth with men. I note that that kind of phase of engagement created a lot of hope and optimism within Uganda and postured Uganda as a state committed to gender equality. But I note that that kind of progress that we registered at that time faced particular forms of resistance because around that time, feminist professor Tamare writes a book which she called When Hens Begin to Crow. And she's reflecting on public resistance towards increasing women's entry in politics. And, you know, the public characterized women as hens which were crowing, something that is culturally unacceptable. But at the same time, 3 years after the Constitution, which brought a lot of hope, we saw women's rights activists going into the land reform process and suggesting that women need to co-own land with their husbands. That proposal was discussed on the floor of Parliament, but later lost in mysterious ways because it never appeared in the final act of Parliament which was passed. And women activists who were heading this process characterized that phase of engagement and the loss of ownership as a moment of truth. That it was a moment that enabled them to look back and say, okay, where is this state that posted itself as committed to gender equality? But it also enabled them to know that the formal processes of the Constitution may not be able to deliver on transformative policy reforms as the land ownership. Given those subtle forms of resistance, we started to see women activists within but also outside Parliament strategically negotiating these forms of patriarchal resistance. And one of the things they did, this resistance, they characterized it as subtle, that needed negotiations of a pragmatic nature. For instance, reference is made to strategic negotiations where some women were requested to tone down the voice of their demands in Parliament as they debated these debates, but also informal soliciting of men to support gender equity reforms in Parliament. And so it is written that, you know, women were requested to tone down their voices, but also to select soft-spoken women, or at times men, to present women's case in a moderate manner accepted by most men in Parliament. And these forms of negotiations were justified at that time as necessary pragmatism that is involved in any parties of unequal power relations. And indeed, in most cases, these negotiations delivered certain policy reforms, e.g. Domestic Violence Act, which was passed through those negotiations, but also the law that prohibited female genital mutilation. I wanted to note that while these negotiations were able to deliver in that case, I think we have not interrogated the long-term cost of negotiating patriarchy. That the kinds of subtle and micro politics that these negotiations produce, the kinds of institutional cultures that are nurtured and legitimized by concessions that we come to, or the whole idea of somebody speaking on behalf of an other in a parliamentary context also seemed like it was a subtle form of backlash that presents itself as gender sensitive. And then these processes of negotiations also seem to point to certain forms of erosion. For instance, during the Domestic Violence Act, the negotiations saw a provision on marital rape dropped because it was deemed contentious and not acceptable to majority of the people in parliament. And so we want to look at what kinds of negotiations do we engage in and what impact do these negotiations have in the long run. I want to stop.
1 or 2 minutes left.
Okay, 2 minutes. So the kinds of erosions saw certain forms of policies watered down, trimmed of contentious clauses, and at some point the feminist activists settling for the minimum. For instance, when the spousal co-ownership clause was lost, we later on saw the debate on spouses required to consent to the sale of land. And so we started to see a wave of, at least we have something on the law books, a sort of narrative that introduces the minimalist agenda, settling for the least, where you should have settled for a transformative gender equity policy reform. I want to stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Eamon. It's a fascinating case. So perhaps without further ado, we'll move over to Sudarshana, and then we'll have, after Tessa, we'll have the conversation between the three of you. So, all right, same time.
Could we have the presentation up, Sinead, if you could get that up? Thank you. So I'll start in terms of the context and giving you a little bit of a context of India. So my provocation is that when you think of backlash in India on gender equality, that has to be understood in the context of broader reversals and democratic backsliding that's happening. The current backlash that we are witnessing right now, it is embedded in a long history of reversals. So it's not that it's coming out all of a sudden, but there has been a confluence of different policy areas and different interest groups that have come together that has led to an intensification of events and policy changes, which along with the onset of pandemic has really resulted in a shock, as Naomi Klein called shock therapy. It's a series of changes and events for which women and other minority communities really find it difficult to cope with and resist. In this current and these kinds of changes, we've actually now reached an inflection point or a critical juncture that has come from this process of either sustained intensification of inaction, which is more hidden, or as Amon just mentioned, it's a very subtler form of resistance, as well as more overt pushbacks. So we're seeing both of those happening at the same time in the current context in India. There is an intentionality behind those inactions. It's not that the inaction is just, people do not think about it, but there is intention behind how people are actually choosing to ignore, deny, and disavow rights of women. And this is, in a way, a sort of preemptive backlash, because you can think of women getting those rights if a particular wave and a particular movement were to be carried forward. There's also pushback against a perceived loss, and this is in terms of a historical injury against particularly the Hindu community. This is from the sort of the injury that India carries and a large community carries from the time of partition, which kind of the construct there is that India is a Hindu nation, and that is the birthright to that Hindu nation of this community. And the third kind of construct that leads to this kind of backlash is really around the defense of the privilege. There is an aggrieved masculinity which really wants to return to a very idealized past where some of the structuralized inequality was normalized. So those are some of the strands that you will kind of see through in the policy changes that I'll go through in the next slide. Sinead, thank you. Yeah. So this is, in sense, I know this is a lot to take, but just very briefly to kind of say that on one hand, we're looking at two things. We have a current majoritarian Hindu nationalistic government, which has received a political mandate, right? A huge political mandate, which is built on the constructs of ethno-nationalism, which is built on the concept of this ideal woman, which is very paternalistic. And also, there is a lot of bombastic masculinity, which is seen or visibilized in increased militarization and policing. This huge mandate has allowed them, as well as the vested interest in terms of the economic, the capitalists, to actually come together to have, on one hand, policies that have curbed civic rights, and on the other hand, in the guise of deregulation, ease of doing business, really taking away many of these really social security that either they had or women and other minority communities were striving for. Right? So you'll see, in one hand, in terms of the policies to curb civic rights, we've had changes in terms of Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Registration of Citizens, which the amendment to Foreign Currency Regulation Act, which is really increasing cost of compliance of nonprofits and putting enormous curbs on the political work of NGOs, because it limits what you can do with foreign funding. There's also an Unlawful Activities or Prevention Act, which is really about curbing dissent through, sometimes, in many cases, in most cases, through false charges, arbitrary detention. And then there are policies and laws which are governing the digital space, in what you can post, how you can post, what you can share. And there's also, in particular to the Muslim community, we're also seeing a revocation of Article 370, which gave Jammu and Kashmir, a particular state within India, a special status, which kind of went from, which is this, again, this aggrieved injury that we see. In terms of the neoliberal economic policies, we've seen in last year itself 3 new farm laws, which are really about the agricultural community, that have been enacted. 4 new labor law codes have been enacted since 2019. And the one which kind of was, the 3 laws which were enacted in 2020 amalgamated about 25 labor laws. And on top of all of this, if you see the COVID response of the government, which announced a lockdown in sort of with a 4-hour notice. 2 minutes?
Yeah. 2 minutes left. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So you would see that there wasn't a gendered response. There wasn't a response that actually looked at marginalized communities within India. What this has done is that it has these two confluence of forces, both the economic and the civic curbing of civic rights, has really shrunk the space for civil society, for dialogue, for deliberation and peaceful protests. It has vilified and demonized a certain group of people, Muslims in particular. It has communalized food habits, dressing, all of that, even further than we had earlier. It has led to a very corporatized media and a very obedient Supreme Court, which is our highest form, and the judiciary largely, and it led to decreased transparency and accountability in governance. It's led to very deepening the fractures in terms of inequality and disempowerment that has only gotten sharper, both as a result of the COVID as well as of taking away some of the social security policies. This has all led to a backlash on gender equality, which is reflected in multiple ways. But most importantly, It's non-recognition of women as citizens with right to work, with right to mobilize and protest, and basic rights in terms of right to choose your partners. It's seen in specific laws in the ways that we're seeing how women's lives are being policed through laws of love jihad and hate crimes, which prohibit you from choosing your partners if they're from another religion. Criminalization of triple talaq, which has been in the name of protecting Muslim women. Transgender persons bill, which was going against what the transgender community wanted, and incarceration of women human rights defenders, especially those young women who are in their 20s and 30s. The latest we have being Disha Ravi, who was only 23, and her only allegation that was made for her was that she had shared a toolkit that Greta Thunberg had actually shared, and because she was supporting the farm laws and the farmers, she was kind of actually solidarity with the farmers she stood. So many of these women's human rights defenders actually standing in solidarity with what's happening outside, not just on women's rights, right? And that's the reason why they're being incarcerated for months and months. A women human rights defender was incarcerated when she was pregnant, 3 months pregnant, and it took her 3 months to actually get bail. So to just think, when we're thinking about gender equality and backlash, we have to think about what's the majority discourse that's coming through in the context of these two conjoining of forces. So I'll stop here and then look towards the conversations.
Great, thank you, Sudarshana. So without that is fascinating. Without further ado, though, can we ask Tessa? Are you okay to go?
Yeah,
next?
I am. Thank you both, Aman and Sudarshana. That was fantastic. So, Sinead, do you mind putting up my slides? Thank you. Wicked. So I should say at the start that I co-convene this strand of work with my colleague Rosie McGee, and so much of my thinking has been done alongside her. And we have been trying to kind of conceptualize what backlash looks like in conversation with our country partners and also with the literature. And we have quite a broad view of policy with the understanding that in the context of populism, cultural politics becomes increasingly important in shaping formal policy processes, in a sense. And we have this conceptualization of the mechanisms of backlash as being a mixture of full frontal assaults, overt myth-making, and undercover myth-making, which is an adaptation of Faludi's conceptualization. And we added the overt myth-making because that seems to be something that's kind of recurring a lot more. And these are all underpinned by threatened material power, this kind of maintenance of historical privilege, and a kind of existential crisis around norms. And I was thinking about this in terms of, I have a 7-year-old who constructs battles between objects and people all the time. There's like this versus this, and I was thinking it's, maintenance of historical privilege versus the promotion of the common good or something. Probably too complex for his terminology, but Sinead, could I have the next slide? Thank you. So one of the ideas that I've been developing in conversation with colleagues is this idea of discourse capture, which comes from the South African notion of state capture, where the mechanisms and the institutions of the state are used for private capital. And this started as a conversation between Sahela and my colleague Sahela Nazneen, and was based on some of the recurring themes in the backlash literature. And then once we had started looking for discourse capture, we saw it everywhere. And it's become one of our tools, I guess, for thinking about the mechanisms of myth-making that are dismantling the systems that protect women's rights. And it's based on this notion that, language has material and political import and impact and a productive power. So what we say does, that arguments create political realities, and that the way we frame things is very important. But also on the notion that if we pay attention to this, we are in a much better position to be able to not just recognize it, but act against it. And some examples of this idea are on the final slide. The first being gender ideology, the idea that has been captured, it's been twisted and re-signified. The idea, as Butler says, there is no ideology of gender. It is a rich academic discipline, and it doesn't espouse a single view. And another one, which I was very interested to find, was La Manif pour tout, which is the French anti-gender movement, which was created to oppose the bill on same-sex marriage in France, but has since broadened its remit to the defense of the traditional family. And there are two immediately apparent manifestations of discourse capture in this name. La Manif, or manifestation, means demonstration, and it's a phenomenon traditionally strongly associated with the left in France. And La Manif pour tout not only co-opted the teeth, but also the language of the same-sex marriage bill itself, which was called le mariage pour tout, marriage for everyone. So it's this kind of mimicking, and there are numerous examples of this. And yeah, this is one of the ideas, I guess, that we've been developing to think about the global mechanisms of backlash. That is all I have to say for now.
Okay.
I was told to be brief.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Tessa. So yeah, thank you, Tessa. That was great. So now I'm wondering which, Tessa, did you want to add something?
I did have some questions for my colleagues, but
co-colleague, exactly. And this is, so maybe that's a good thing. So since you've had more time to digest what you've heard from them, perhaps you could start by asking Eamon and Sudarshana any questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you both. Eamon, I wanted to ask you, because as you know, we have another Ugandan partner in our consortium, and they've talked about about backlashes as not existing, because they've articulated Museveni's style as kind of hollow lip service and preemptive inaction in a way that kind of subverts any possible backlash. And I was wondering if that resonates with your understanding of Ugandan politics. And yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Tessa, for flagging that. I think one of the things that has been very fruit in conceptualizing is the concept of backlash. But if we look at backlash as that kind of reaction that comes as a result of progress that has been registered in terms of women's rights, then you can say there is a lot of that to see. And also there is a possibility not to see it because of its gradual and insidious nature that it takes. Sometimes it comes packaged as normal everyday life. Sometimes it might have a tag that looks like gender equity. But when you look at increasing number of women entering politics and that, their efforts towards passing laws that you would think are engaging with power, like ownership of land, being consistently and systematically resisted, from domestic relations bill to co-ownership of land to marriage and divorce bill, consistently shelved for more than 50 years. I think if that is not seen as backlash, then we might need to revisit the concept itself. So I think there is a sense in which every step that women's rights activism takes, it sort of generates another form of wave of resistance, and that is what I would like to see as backlash. Although I would like to on the issue of intentionality, Hundu was talking about the idea of intentions behind inaction, which sort of is similar to what you're asking to me. How do you tell that this is an intentional strategy to frustrate a particular gender equity action? So maybe Hundu can weigh in terms of how do you tell the intentionality and that this is deliberate, intentional, and aimed at stopping this?
Yes. So Sudarshana, did you want to come in and make comment on that?
Sure. I mean, it's something that we want to pursue further and understand this a little better. I mean, this is what we are contending, that this is what we're seeing or we think that's happening. But if you in particular see some of the strands, and which is what we're trying to do with mostly, let's say, the domestic worker or health worker. And as I was saying, we've had a complete upheaval of labor codes right now, right? Which had a huge opportunity, and it was kind of said that this is going to really broaden and really provide more greater rights for workers across, right? But if you actually see the new labor codes, and they're very paternalistic in some senses, like more, will provide for some of these benefits and, increase maternity benefit, some of those, right? Which were demands from women workers. But at the same time, when you think of where most of the women workers are in systems like health and domestic work, these are completely absent from the new labor reforms that have come forward, right? You've actually completely kind of not included the concept of domestic work as work itself, right? As and when you had an opportunity to even revise and review your labor codes, you've completely ignored that, right? And so much so that if you actually look at labor movement in India, and if you look at women's unions and women worker groups, for them to register themselves as trade union, it's so hard to do so because this concept of domestic work as work itself is completely absent, right? And that's why we're kind of saying that this is actually, this sustained inaction is deliberate. It's kind of, it's intentioned that you are going to non-recognize work. In the same sense, you have health workers at the complete ground level who actually more or less subsidize the entire health system. Again, they're considered as voluntary community mobilizers and not treated as workers, right? And they're paid a salary of maybe $20 a month, and they subsidize the entire, and especially the COVID vaccination programs and all of the other really essential delivery of services at the community level is really rests on them. And yet there has been steadfast refusal to consider them as workers, right? So those are two instances. And if you now look at labor force participation rate, formal labor force participation rate within India, that's actually decreased over the last 30 years, ever since liberalization has taken place, which is contrary to what we would have expected with, opening up of markets, opening up of opportunities and all of that. Women are actually going away from the formal labor force participation, partly because of de-recognition of work, partly also because of sort of the paternalistic nature, which keeps women from being at home and retaining the status as the women at home. So those are things that we mentioned.
So Dustin, I was wondering, in the context of you conceptualizing backlash as within the kind of broader reversal and democratic backsliding, to what extent the counter-backlash movement is intersectional explicitly, and what coalitions are being seen.
Right. Thanks. It just also to kind of, as you kind of recognized, I think a lot of what I'm also saying is also with Shraddha, who is the co-lead for our policy and practice stream in India, just to mention that. In terms of looking at, there are alliances that are coming together. One is a People's Action Movement, the National Alliance for People's Movement, where you're seeing right now, especially when the farmers' agitation came together, you're actually seeing workers, domestic workers, and other informal workers come together with the farmers and in solidarity. And there is alliances that are happening now because there is understanding that these are there is a common strand of oppression that goes with for each of these agricultural laborers as well as informal workers. So we're seeing a lot of that coming together right now, and there is solidarity in the form of common memos as well as the agitations itself. At the same time, when the Shaheen Bagh protests happened, right, which was really about CA and NRC and Muslim, it was not just pertaining to Muslim women, but Muslim women took the lead in terms of protestations. You actually saw the youth, especially college students, but also women's rights organizations and activists from across the board come together. So you're also seeing coalitions and alliance building happening there in terms of coming together. We're also seeing in some cases, and I think there is so less so, which is because the complexities are very different, where you have forestry rights acts and the tribal, Dalit, Adivasi women and their land access to land rights is kind of being pushed back. But you're also seeing violence against women, state oppression and state perpetrated violence against women. That's where again you'll see coalition building happening with other women's rights groups. So there are strands and there is an intersectionality in terms of looking at some of these, especially with Muslim women's and Muslim women's rights and Dalit and Adivasi rights. And that's sort of the efforts of the counter-backlash movement to make that more visible.
Thanks, that's really interesting.
Great. Can I tap in with a question as abusing a couple of minutes left on this, and maybe Eamon, you wanted to come in first on those points. I just had another question reflecting on a discussion going on in the chat line. But Eamon, did you want to reflect on that discussion, or shall I ask something?
You can add something.
Okay. So there's been some questions in the chat line around the difference between resistance and backlash, and it kind of connects to, so there's been some discussion here about intentionality and the idea of preemptive backlash indeed. So it's not necessarily always against some progress has already been made, but it is still an action. It might be a reactive one, but it's still an action. But there's also been broader debates about, so Korea, Paternotte, and Kuhar, I believe, these debates about broader sets of movements that have all sorts of objectives that are not primarily necessarily about gender. Mm-hmm. So fascist or extreme right movements concern about ethno-nationalism and ethnicity and race. Other movements or religious movements concerned about family values and heteronormative ideas of families and so on. And then, populist politicians. We had this discussion in the second session, in fact, populist politicians that promiscuously are kind of jumping on the bandwagon of divisive language and othering. and then all using gender as a kind of symbolic glue to unite around, and as a convenient tool to get other objectives through. I mean, I'm simplifying somewhat. So these are complex dynamics. And so with relation to resistance and backlash, there is an ongoing debate in the literature about this. And of course, there's debate because resistance can look more like, at the individual level, it's, gendered violence, or it is at the structural level, kind of structural violence. But that's an ongoing maintenance of a patriarchal order. And most commentators seem to agree that for backlash to be meaningful, it has to be something beyond that. It has to be something that is more episodic and current and is actively kind of pushing against. So I shouldn't talk, but I just wanted to reflect on that and acknowledge how complex this is, and just give you a chance for last thoughts before we hand over to Andrea to bridge the session to the international level. Anybody want to reflect on this resistance backlash? Does that help in terms of disentangling what we're talking about? Sudarshana?
No, I was just saying it's still quite complex, right? I mean, that it's like, is this resistance, and at what point can we kind of start calling it a kind of backlash? And this thing about, have we reached that inflection point? Have we reached that critical juncture from which that's one of the things that we're trying to see as a test case, that it has this reached an inflection point that was, or a critical path from which it is difficult to unravel institutions, right? Your institutional power dynamics has changed in a way which is quite different from what just resistance to some kind of changes in laws or some of that have happened. So that's one kind of construct that we're trying to think of when we're trying to differentiate between a resistance and just a backlash, because there has to be that kind of point, and your institutions have transformed in particular ways where it becomes difficult for you to go back to just a continued path of what the backlash and maintaining status quo was. So that's one thought.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Eamon, Tessa?
Everyone, and then I'm happy to say something.
Argument is the deliberate lookout of what is the intention behind these actions, as we have already added. But also adding into the complexity is the, for instance, the need to look at these broader sets of movements that you have talked about, macro processes, which may not necessarily set out to be targeting gender relations, but in their actions, they may cause an environment in which you're not able to progress on those fronts. Because if you have a dictatorship that has eroded any space for engagement, whether the debate is about gender equality or any other liberal values, you may not be able to advance. So I think we need to look at that complexity, not necessarily to limit it to it is targeting gender and therefore it's gender backlash. We need to look at that broader context.
Thank you. Great point. Tessa, do you have any closing thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, these are conversations that we have again and again, right? This kind of, is it episodic? Is it continual? Is it every day? Is it about the intensity? Is it about the tipping point where there's no turning back? And also whether we should be limiting our study of backlash to the gender backlash, or whether that's even possible, yeah. And I mean, it's definitely useful to carry on asking all these questions, because I mean, we are right in all of our, and I guess the thing to do is to be interrogating each of those policy entry points with those framings as well.
Right. Thank you. So I think it's about time we had. Sorry, did you want to add to that, Tessa, or did I cut you off?
No.
Okay, sorry.
No.
Yeah, so just I spotted another comment in the chat line about the sophisticated analysis, developed analysis by Backlash forces from Russ Funk in the chat line, which I think is a really good point, because when you were talking about intersectional alliances in terms of countering backlash, what is needed is absolutely a sophisticated understanding of what forces are at play, which enabling forces and which active forces are at play, and how those may not always be about gender. So on that note, I think I shall hand over to Andrea to tell us a little bit about your experiences of witnessing all this in different spaces.
Thank you.
About 10 minutes.
Thank you. So I'm speaking from a very local context, which is the School of Oriental and African Studies that's just behind me in the picture, where I am a member of the senior management team, and I'm also the chair of the Equality and Diversity Committee. On Monday, on Women's Day, a gender critical feminist posted onto our union list a piece about the dangerous denial of sex and how trans women are not women. And there was a furious debate that emerged with people, trans people and allies coming out onto the list and speaking to this person and saying, this is unacceptable, you can't say these things. And I was thinking, you know, these debates are very live for us in the UK in our own institution. The backlash is real. It's happening in our own workspaces. I've been part of a participant observation type of research for a number of years, probably about 10 years now, and I'm still haven't got round to writing it up, but the story gets more interesting whenever I dip into it. In the UN's CSW, which started with me stumbling into the wrong room one day. And I was used to listening to people who had the same views as me, and these people totally didn't. And they used the concept of gender too. It was about 10 years ago. And I became absolutely fascinated, and I developed an alternative persona. And I then attended all of these meetings and became part of lists. And I'm now, you know, I'm warned when dangerous sexual rights activists are trying to push something through at the UN because I'm on these lists. So I think, Ruth, your point is very right. Not only are these people very, very well informed, they're informed by theoretical tracts, training courses. They bring delegates to the CSW to training courses prior to the CSW to prep them to go into those spaces. And also people going into the civil society spaces, very, very well prepped with arguments. They've built an extensive discourse coalition, and the discourse coalition has spanned well beyond actors who would have anything in common apart from an opposition to certain framings of the way in which gender is used. And so gender provides a convening principle that brings together otherwise progressive femocrats from the EU, Scandinavia, at times as well, unfortunately, and also brings a very, very extreme conservative actors, evangelical Christian and Catholic actors, radical feminists. There's a very expansive discourse coalition around the politics of the body, as we've been speaking. And I think what's really interesting is how the concept of gender travels in those spaces. So I started doing a kind of biography of gender, trying to understand what's happened to gender in the last 20 or 30 years. Where has it traveled? How has it been used? And gender ideology originally comes from a critique of ideologies of gender that reduce women to housewives and sort of objects of, you know, representation. And, you know, the kind of classic heteropatriarchal norms were regarded as gender ideology. Now the meaning's turned around a completely the opposite way and is being mobilized as a way of bringing people together around traditional values of the family, dealing with these levels of sort of outrage, moral outrage about the body and about queer and trans rights. So I think it's really interesting to track what's happening in those discourse coalitions. One of the things which I think, just to give an example, the last time I went to the CSW, I went to conference room 1, which is the biggest room inside the UN, where absolutely packed full of people. And there was nothing to disagree with on what they were saying. They had talking about value chains, about exploitation. They were not making any reference in particular to any particular actors. They just pulled together a very, very broad and expansive social justice narrative, talking about neoliberalism. And these were people from all of those actors that I've spoken about, who then went on in other sessions to mobilize against anything around sexual and reproductive rights of the kind that I might otherwise have attended a session around. And I found it really, really fascinating. So seeing these people moving from fringe events to main space, seeing them suturing together critiques of neoliberalism, climate justice, all kinds of things are being bundled together very cleverly, and gender being mobilized as a way as well to do this, inviting into them all of these other actors who otherwise would have nothing in common with them around particular issues around which what I would call feminist frictions emerge, which are around the politics of the body. And the body becomes a particularly contested site. And this contestation around the category woman, which was the foundation for so many debates when the concept of gender came about in the first place, now being mobilized very actively to push back very, very hard and roll back in those spaces so many gains. And I also look at the CSW with the zero document, and then what happens with attempts to try and get language in or out of the document, and just how difficult it is to hold that space in these times. And I think just to cut to the chase, really, I think what Tessa said is really interesting about this idea of discourse capture. This is a classic example of it. I think the full frontal assaults are increasing with impunity. People are being able to, and we have a government where key members of our government, ministers, can say there's no need for white people to be talking anything about white privilege. We shouldn't be questioning anything around gender. We've got people sitting in our government making laws who are now people are part of that discourse coalition. It's really serious, and it's coming into our schools and universities. And I think also this idea, so the idea of a discourse coalition, all the literature around that's also quite interesting to look at from environmental science, mainly Haya and other people. How does it get constructed? What alliances form? And also, I think just to leave, this intervention with, is the idea from Ernest Laclau of a chain of equivalence. And what he argues is that certain words, if they're brought together into a chain of equivalence, their original meanings get sloughed away. So you can put together, feminism, tradition, men, women into a thing. And then feminism becomes about protecting men and women and tradition and family. Seems odd, but it happens with these new discourse coalitions, this discourse coalition that's been formed. So I think breaking the chains of equivalence, interjecting, having different ways of, messing around with those words, reframing the words, tracing some of the words and where they come from. There's a lot of stuff around words in these international spaces. That's what the spaces are about. They're often words in English, and they've got repertoires and they've got resonances. And I think working with some of the politics of naming and words and disrupting those spaces, making their dissonance really evident, is a kind of political tactic that's quite, that people are doing, but I think could be amplified. And I think this project could be very, very interesting in doing that. So making really clear where those people just don't agree at all, where there are whole areas that they would never agree on and have nothing in common, is also interesting to put out into the public domain. Say, well, why are these people agreeing on this thing? Because obviously they've got nothing in common in terms of how they see, women's rights or gender equality. It doesn't get named enough. And I think that's something which you're doing and can do more of. But I'll stop there with those thoughts. And thank you. It's really interesting.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. Fascinating, and a great way to sort of broaden our horizons from what goes on in specific country contexts as well. And I think in the interest of time, we should move into the next conversation with Lena and Laura. And then, Andrea, you can come back and chair the plenary, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'd just like to apologise to everybody. I had one of those things that I feel so embarrassed about because it's such an English thing to do. And that's assume that an invitation for 3 o'clock meant 3 o'clock my time. It didn't, it meant 3 o'clock Geneva time, which is now. So I need to be in a meeting in Geneva. So I'm very sorry. I'd message you, Jörg, if you haven't seen it, but just to I look forward to seeing the recording afterwards. But in your
no problem. We'll handle the plenary without you. But thank you so much for coming and for sharing those reflections and insights.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Let us then truck straight ahead in the agenda. In the interest of time, we're now going to go upstairs, or sort of regional and global, or rather global, in terms of international development and what it means for the development sector, gender and development. And I'll be asking Lena and Laura a few questions to respond to, react to. So I will start. It's about development agencies, policy co-option, and backlash of the kind we've heard about. What are some of the tensions, trade-offs, and tactics that are going on or being adopted? So perhaps I could start with, I was thinking of starting with Sweden and with you, Lena, because SIDA, of course, is one of the agencies, along with Canada and a few others, who have an international or feminist international development policy. And of course, backlash is presumably right up on your radar. So what do you see in the way of this kind of backlash or co-option as SIDA? And how do you respond? How does the agency respond to those kinds of dynamics? Would you be able to share some thoughts on that?
Yes, now I have unmuted myself also. Thank you. Yeah, so very much what I've heard from the previous speakers and also from the whole Men Engage Ubuntu symposium resonates very well with what we hear and see at SIDA. And we have experiences both in policy spaces where SIDA together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as Team Sweden is operating, and also in practice from what we hear from our partner organizations all over the world. And the stories we hear are very similar, which really reinforms that it's a global backlash. And we also hear how well organized and resourced it is. And in terms from the policy perspective, what we see is, of course, the push for regressive language in international human rights document, development of alternative resolutions such as the Geneva Consensus Declaration. And we also hear, of course, the pushback against the word gender equality, wanting to go back to language on women and girls, as the word gender equality is often seen as promoting LGBTI rights. And we saw this, for example, during the development of the EU Gender Action Plan 3. And we also hear from our country office that there are countries in Europe who would like to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence. And also in the whole area of SRHR, of course, we have seen a backlash, a pushback in conferences, the push for on restricting abortion laws in some countries, the pushback against comprehensive sexual education. This is, of course, not new, but it's becoming stronger in some context. And also that governments have introduced and reinforced surveillance and laws to curtail democracy and human rights. And our partner organization also, they tell us a lot about how the backlash is and the shrinking space for civil society and the pandemic. When it comes together, it really makes the unequal power relations more visible. And of course, it's the most marginalized population and those living in fragility and conflict affected areas that are especially targeted. And we also hear a lot on our human rights defenders that we work with, how they are targeted during the backlash. For example, our partner Kvinna till Kvinna conducted a report with women's rights defenders in 32 countries. And over 60% announced that the spaces to act has shrunk over the past year. And also 85% said that, responded that human rights defenders are affected to a larger extent than men are through decreasing possibility of funding, being pushed back through traditional roles, violence, etc. And we also hear from our partners about how human rights activists and others, LGBTI activists, are harassed online and offline, and that cyber attacks is quite common against local organizations. And with the shutdown of internet makes it also difficult for many activists to meet online. And also in combination with that is, of course, the pandemic with the sexual reproductive health and maternal services being reduced and the increase in gender-based violence because of the lockdowns. But on the positive side, we also hear that from Swedish embassies and our partners that there is like women's organization and gender movements are also pushing back and organizing themselves. And for example, taking a very active role in demonstrations against repressive governments. And also how women's organizations are monitoring the situation, sharing knowledge, building coalitions, etc. And like-minded organizations are also, of course, meeting and strategizing. And we also now have the GAP3, even the Gender Action Plan EU, which is quite strong. And we also have the US who abolished the gag rule. So at the same time, there is also positive development despite the big backlash. So how do Sweden respond then? So of course, gender equality and women and girls empowerment has been a fundamental aim of Swedish foreign policy for a long time. But with the feminist foreign policy, means that gender equality is central in all decision making and resource allocation, and annual plans and handbooks have been developed, and it covers all foreign policy. So we also have a feminist trade policy at the moment. But what does it mean in practice? And what I've seen is the Swedish embassy and the Swedish ambassadors are now even more proactively talking about gender equality, which is very key in the situation of the backlash. And the normative dialogue is, of course, essential for all of us. And we also try through the embassies to create spaces where human rights activists can meet and strategize. And at SIDA, we have also formed an informal internal group with representatives from different departments, which are following the backlash to see how does this affect SIDA's work and what can we do more. So working together, I mean, internally and externally. And also with the shrinking space and the little resources that is allocated through women's rights organization, with less than 1% of all ODA goes to this organization. We also promoted, prioritized supporting women's rights organization through our gender equality plan and through our global strategy for gender equality. So I think a strategy for us is also to be flexible and as supportive as possible and provide core funding when feasible. And also through supporting organizations that provide rapid response and strategic support to women's human rights defenders, and to organizations who provides digital security. And of course, continuing to support local organizations that are working to challenging social norms, that are also engaging men and boys, etc. Organizations that are pushing for revising restrictive family laws, etc. So there is a lot that can be done to support the movement. But as an agency, I would say there is, of course, much more we can do. So therefore, it's also very interesting for us to follow this area with the backlash, to learn more, and also to follow the ODI research to see what will be the recommendation coming out of that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And interesting that you mentioned like-minded agencies, and I'm thinking that might mean Canada or other maybe EU. And I'm just curious as to what maybe a quick reflection on how is that going? Working with like-minded other policy makers and agencies, and other particular needs in that area that need attention. Exactly.
So it depends on the issue, of course, on the whole SRHR. So we are mobilizing and working with those organizations that are promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights, European governments and other organizations, in terms of when there is a big conferences to strategize, to give common message, of course, through the EU. And we are also part of the OECD, the GenderNet, which is a group for policymakers and practitioners, where we meet and learn experiences and tactics and what we see. So it's more of a group for practitioners to learn more from each other.
Okay, great. And this point about women and girls as a framing, of course, we've seen that in many agencies, particularly here in the UK, it became the overarching framing for a number of years, which some people would argue is very rooted in a kind of neoliberal framing of down, reduce the problem to individual problems for women and girls and misbehaving men and boys, and fix that by changing social norms and all of that. But it might be a good point, since we're talking a little bit about what happens internationally and maybe UN Women's role in all of this, perhaps generating. So this is why we've asked Laura, you to come on in your role as leading research and data at UN Women, because that's obviously so crucial to these discussions at the global level. So from your perspective, how do you perceive the issues of backlash in these multilateral spaces?
Thanks, Ilka, and thanks so much for the invitation. I'm getting messages that my network's a bit weak, so if I get interrupted, just give me a wave. But thanks so much for the invitation to be here, and it's a real pleasure to listen to all of the other speakers so far. I just wanted to sort of preface, a little bit what Jörg has already said. UN Women is engaged as an institution in many ways in relation to this issue of backlash, and not least in supporting civil society and women's organisations who are under so much pressure at this moment, and working across the UN system with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and developing guidance and so on around all of that. But I just wanted to, in this space, speak on, I guess, give some more kind of personal reflections on my experience in the research team at UN Women, and specifically around the last edition of the Progress of the World's Women report that we produced, focused on families in a changing world. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why we chose to focus the report on that, and then how that kind of process unfolded a little bit. So I think, as we've already discussed, and Andrea spoke very eloquently about, this issue of families, traditional families, diverse families, has become a huge touchstone for conservative actors who want to push back against gender equality and also the LGBT equality agenda. And as has already been said, we see in the intergovernmental sphere very well organised conservative actors supported by member states and observer states. They're very active at CSW, and this issue of family and family diversity becomes a major sticking point in the CSW agreed conclusions. Often with the Europeans and the Latins, arguing for the inclusion of the word, even pluralizing the word families, with other states pushing back and insisting on, the family being included and the need to protect it. And as has already been said, this issue of family is a kind of is an umbrella for every single hot button feminist issue you can imagine, from SRHR to land rights to discriminatory family laws to violence against women. It really does encompass absolutely, most things. And the activism around the traditional family has also been expanded into the Human Rights Council, where there's a regular resolution on the protection of the traditional family. And then another kind of space is the International Day of Families, which is on the 15th of May, which was started after the Copenhagen conference in the early 90s. And the idea originally was that it was framed around a very progressive social policy agenda, recognizing the importance of families and the need to support them, and an explicit recognition that families are diverse. But this is now also being used as a space by the conservative actors to kind of push their agenda. So when we were thinking about Progress of the World's Women, which is UN Women's flagship report, what should we focus the report on? We alighted on this idea of taking on the issue of families, because it is also such an important issue for feminists, right? Feminists have been theorizing for decades about, families, what happens in families, how women's rights are, progressed or held back within families, and mobilizing around progressive family policies on, support to lone parents, cash transfers, family leaves, and so on. And then more recently, feminists have also been central to, arguing for a more expansive notion of families to encompass, same-sex partnerships, recognition for single parents, families of choice, etc., and even to dismantle the entire institution of family altogether. So it's an important issue for feminists. The CSW agreed conclusions in 2017. Also, the activists around the agreed conclusions on the more progressive side managed to get a mention into the agreed conclusions, calling for the development of a set of family-friendly policies. So we also wanted to use the report to answer that call. Here is your progressive agenda. So for all these reasons, we decided to address the issue of families and women's rights. And through the process of producing and launching the report, we tried to employ three kind of main tactics or approaches to sort of intervening in this issue. So the first was about reframing and reclaiming the family as a set of relations that can and should enable women's rights. The second was around agenda setting, kind of creating and fostering discussions that could in some way depolarize the issue of families and forge common ground around a progressive policy agenda. And then amplifying and legitimizing existing initiatives for progressive change. So whether that's on, reform of discriminatory laws or on land rights or on sexual and reproductive health and rights, we could use the kind of, if you like, the heft of a UN report to kind of, lend credence to those agendas. So our strategy was quite premised around trying to stake out a middle ground. We aimed to bring together a diverse group of member states and actors on the basis that the debate had become very polarized and that there was a silent majority group of member states who are not on the extremely conservative side, but they may not also be on the very progressive side. And we tried to emphasize policy areas like social protection, where we knew there would be a lot of support from many countries, and then use those policy entry points as a way to make an argument for policies tailored to the diverse realities of families today. And then we also use data to demonstrate the diversity of families. So as a matter of fact, we pulled together all of the, the UN has access to enormous amounts of extremely interesting data. We pulled it all together to show, as a matter of empirical fact, that families across the world, across time and so on, are diverse. And that's not a question of moral principle one way or the other, it's just a fact. So our approach in that way was a sort of moderate one, if you like, and our tactic was aimed at going beyond the deadlock to identify specific issues where we could get traction, and then about widening the alliances, right? So calling more member states in to support this agenda for families as a space for equality and justice. But the trade-off, therefore, was that although the report makes it very clear that we're in support of LGBT rights, to partnership recognition, to adoption, and so on, this wasn't always the issue that we led on in terms of our outreach and our sort of key messages. Before we launched the report, we did a briefing for civil society colleagues working on LGBT issues, and they were very welcoming of the report. They did see it as a useful tool and a step forward, and we made it clear that we really hoped that they would be able to use it as part of their advocacy efforts. So then the question, just my sort of final set of points is, did the approach work? And I think with the families report, the jury is still out, and I think, we would love to do a bit more research really on looking at the influence of that report and how it's been used and so on. But in terms of kind of more informal reflections, I think some of the manifestations of backlash that we're seeing that people have already talked about presented significant challenges to us. So the first one is about reframing, right? We wanted to kind of reframe the idea of what families are, what families mean to women, how they can be spaces of both solidarity and love, but also of danger and discrimination for women, and to make the case that progressive family policies really matter in achieving women's rights. But of course, we see that some conservative governments are also incredibly keen on policies to support families, and in some cases, they're pretty generous in providing social protection for families, as long as those families fit a particular normative idea of what a family should be. So in our report, in our families report, when we talk about the importance of families, and we mean supporting diverse families, is the distinction clear or clear enough? So to give one example, I attended an event for the International Day of Families and made a comment from the floor about the importance of family-friendly policies to support women's rights and diverse families. And the representative from Hungary came speeding up to me afterwards and was thrilled that we were on the same page. Hungary has great family policies. So in a way, if your attempt to reframe something can simply be reframed, then, something's gone wrong. I mean, I guess it's just a reflection on the dynamic process of framing, reframing, and so on. The second kind of reflection is about the use of facts or data. We placed a lot of store on the idea that we can show empirically that families are diverse, and, if we get that information out and we put forward a really good set of policies and a progressive agenda, then then we can convince people and they will take on our agenda and take it forward. But we came up with a global figure that only 1/3 or less than 1/3 of families globally are nuclear, a man, a woman, and children or whatever. But the Conservatives are not very concerned about that because theirs is a moral stance, right? Empirical data is not of such great importance to them. And of course, they have their own data. They have the data that, children from lone parent families do less well in school and all of that stuff. And the fact that only 1/3 of families are nuclear globally, for them, is the problem, right? And so that's the reason that they want to continue to advance their agenda. The decline in the nuclear family is the root of society's problems for them. So in a way, this assumption of, producing this data and coming up with a policy agenda and so on, it is, I guess, a technical kind of approach to an issue that is fundamentally a political issue. And I think at the end of the day, we knew this, and I think we tried to use what we had at our disposal as UN Women, in fact, as the research team in UN Women, to contribute to addressing the issue. And I think the set of experience illustrates that there are quite a number of major constraints that we face in doing that. So UN Women is an intergovernmental organisation. The traction that we seek with these reports depends on them being acceptable to some extent with member states. And already with this report, we had concerns from colleagues, in different country offices that they really wouldn't be able to launch this report. UN Women is a very small organisation. I mean, much bigger than, of course, has much more power than, many, many tiny civil society organisations that are absolutely at the forefront of this issue and really struggling. But within the UN system, we're really a kind of a minnow, and we are quite vulnerable to this kind of criticism in terms of being even further defunded than we already are. So in these reports, we do fall back heavily on human rights frameworks and commitments and so on. And on some issues like the LGBT equality agenda, it's quite underdeveloped in the human rights system. And then the third thing is about the issue of gender equality in the intergovernmental system has always proceeded by consensus. So that's why at CSW we have agreed conclusions. There's not a vote. And that's why arguably we have such slow incremental change or even no change at all. And sometimes it's literally about holding the line and not allowing further aggression. If you don't proceed by consensus, then you arguably have even more geopolitical wrangling, where you have the Swedens and the Canadas and the progressive states on one side, and a lot of the global south countries on the other, which arguably is also a huge problem when you're trying to advance this agenda. So in conclusion, I think for all of these reasons, I think UN Women is in quite an ambiguous position when it comes to countering backlash, especially when it comes from member states themselves. And I think, this issue is definitely not going away. I think we need to do more reflection on how we address it in different aspects of our work. If I was to draw a single conclusion, I think for our work on research and policy advocacy, there's always more that we can do to kind of activate the sort of insider-outsider alliances that have been so important and successful for feminist activism. Which is about understanding how we're positioned, how other actors are positioned, and strategizing together and thinking through, what can we say as UN Women, what can you say as civil society, to counter the backlash that we're seeing and to advance the shared agenda for change. So thank you very much. Okay,
thank you, Laura. That's fascinating. Great. I had another question for both of you, but I realize we have a half hour left. I'm wondering if in a minute or in a minute each, you could, if only if you have any thoughts on the question, given everything you've said, what recommendations would you have for the Men Engage Alliance and its members in terms of countering backlash in this kind of policy spaces and arenas? So, Lena, maybe you want to go first, and Laura, just very quickly.
Yeah, I can start very quickly. And thanks for all the interesting presentations so far, I forgot to say. So I think, something that comes out also the importance of mobilizing for new supporters and allies for gender equality broader, those who are more remain neutral at the moment, to engage more with the environment and climate change activists, LGBTI movement and the youth movement, those who have a similar agenda but don't specifically speak about gender equality, and those who also in the public who remain neutral. So we need to have sort of more allies. And I think also for civil society to really continuing to monitor the human rights spaces, to UPR, etc., and the treaty bodies to listen what governments are saying and to find ways of engaging in constructive dialogues where it's possible. And I think also to have those left behind at the center for whatever action we do. And another thing is the online, offline spaces that are so connected. And I think, so this is sort of in a way for all of us that we need to focus more on what is happening online and understand, and so that we understand the strategies there and also can develop counter strategies online. And finally, also the whole gender socialization. We often forget also that, and I think we need more of a child rights perspective to, as children learn from an early age, gender roles and how can we provide alternatives, for example, to boys who are learning social norms online through promoting non-stereotypical roles through media, computer games, etc. To think a bit broader how we can reach and engage with children and youth.
Okay, thank you. So really echoing some of the themes that are coming out for the Alliance, I think, around intersectional alliances, strengthening that HR monitoring that perhaps links to the Alliance's kind of focus on accountability to women's movements, but also to human rights more broadly. And then gender socialization, young boys and girls and child rights connections. So Laura, do you, forgive me if I misinterpreted any of that, but those were my takeaways. Laura, do you want to have any last reflection?
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear what others think, really. I think the kind of reflection that I have on this, we commissioned a paper recently by Alan Grieg and Michael Flood on, a sort of review of the kind of men and boys field and, where have we got to a stock taking. And I think one of the things that I'm sort of quite taken with in their sort of approach is this idea of, moving away from sort of approaches that are kind of about changing individual, men's behaviors and attitudes and so on. I think there's a space for that, but, trying to build up some of the more kind of political work, the political allyship of men on these issues. And I think just a kind of one reflection is that, when we were preparing the families report, we had a couple of sort of, informal closed meetings with, some of the kind of more supportive member states, and tried to kind of bring together a diversity of states and not just the usual suspects. And actually, most of the representatives were men, and they, many of them were very active in the CSW space, holding the line on sexual and reproductive health and rights, on, many of the other kind of contentious gender issues. So it might be interesting to, as part of an ongoing research program on this issue, to kind of look at, the role of men and the alliances that, that they form, perhaps supporting one another in those spaces to be allies and to help hold the line on some of these issues. But yeah, that's mostly what I wanted to say on that.
Great. Thanks, Laura. So that report's really interesting, and we've heard about it in the symposium. Of course, Alan also spoke on the first of these sessions in this series. Issue of moving away from this kind of perhaps neoliberal but individualistic focus on changing individual men and perhaps social norms, but also thinking of men in positions of power as well, and not just power, but as agents of change and as allies within institutions and bureaucracies as well. All good food for thought. Now we've got about less than 25 minutes left for a broader discussion. Thanks for sharing links and continuing conversations in the chat line. I saw another comment about the impacts of COVID and what that does to the backlash. And I think there's been quite a little bit's been written about that, but it's a big topic and perhaps one that we can address in the discussion. But Sinead, please come in if you have thoughts. We had originally thoughts of breakout rooms, but I actually think we probably don't have enough time for that, but could more usefully have an open discussion, a plenary discussion, where people can either put questions into the chat line and or raise your hands, and we can try and facilitate those questions. I already see one hand raised from Chloe Skinner. Shall we hear from Chloe? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks everyone. That was really, really interesting. And what I've been finding as you've been talking is, well, just, I mean, generally, is a growing sense of anger. So then I was thinking, following on from particularly Eamon and Tessa's presentation, as well as Andrea's, is not only discourse capture, but also affect capture. So through Backlash, who is allowed to be affected, who is allowed to be angry, who is allowed to be outraged, who's allowed to be loud, basically. And I'm thinking here in terms of tone policing as a big part of the backlash of women, LGBTQ, Black, other ethnic minorities. And this sense that outrage at injustice increasingly seemingly needing to be toned down and to make it palatable to those in power or with privilege, like in Eamon's example around soft-spoken women. I found that really interesting. And we kind of see gaslighting on so many levels. So that kind of downplaying of anger, that downplaying of other affects of intersecting injustice. So in the UK, for example, we have backlash against wokery from the Common Sense group. So Tory MPs who exist to challenge the woke agenda. So again, downplaying outrage, justifiable outrage. But then meanwhile, on the other hand, we've got populist politicians, figureheads of the culture wars, kind of online vitriol, movements such as La Manif pour Tous, sorry about my bad French, and they kind of visibly and viscerally express anger. And Andrea spoke of moral outrage, while we've got the Common Sense group who I mentioned, who kind of counter a justifiable anger with a kind of calm down, dear, we have common sense, just, be quiet, calm down. So I'd love to hear, it's just an idea that was brewing, and I'd love to speak to Jirka and Tessa about a mini project of encountering backlash on it, on affect capture. So I'd just love to hear some of the speakers' thoughts on that, on affect capture, who can claim anger, who can have that heard and validated. And then also, if we put that in terms of gaslighting, I'd really like to consider the embodied effects of it, because that's repressive, it's invalidating, it shuts you down. So for those within movements, individuals, policymakers, that's kind of exhausting, tiring, belittling, wearing. So it kind of erodes and excludes. So I wonder if it's A, intentional, B, if other people see that and feel that, and yeah, just what you think of that kind of following on from discourse capture to affect capture.
Okay. Do any of the panelists want to have a go at responding to that? Tessa?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. And maybe Amon, you want to talk about it, given that it came from a provocation from your talk.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to track these things across our various partnerships.
Thank you, Tessa and Chloe, for raising that. Who has the right to get angry? And I think that question also speaks to what Andrew Cornwall was talking about, the journey that the concept of gender has traveled, and how alongside that journey, the concept has been trimmed of its potential to analyze transformative prospects, analyzing power and complexities of power, and reducing it to, in some cases, to men and women, boys and girls, and sometimes creating polarities which sort of become the foundation upon which this anger plays upon. We recently had a conversation with women's rights activists, and it was so shocking how engaging men in gender equality is constituted in some ways as a backlash that men are in charge once again, only that this time they are in charge of gender equality, an aspect that has been in the armpits of women. And I think as we look at discourse capture, affect capture, we need to look at the place of rethinking the concept of gender, to look at how we can accommodate diversities and complexities of understanding social relations beyond individual men against individual women. And I was also thinking that we perhaps could also look at how we can disentangle the negative, and sometimes they are called uncritical engagement of men. In some ways, we have had cases celebrating men as champions of gender equality, and you get this individual man who is being, postured under a particular role reform. The next day on the floor of parliament, they say something, and you're like, okay, so what sort of championship is that? That kind of problematics that come into an approach that would otherwise have been, very critical, very accountable to women's rights. How do we disentangle the binary reactions to reach a level where, both men and women and other categories of the population have a critical role to play in pushing for gender equality? So I think that is where I can leave it for now, Chloe.
Thank you, Eamon. Just to, I see Tessa has her hand up, but it does remind me of a discussion I watched last night on France 24, where Laura was speaking at a French news channel about women's leadership as prime ministers and politicians and so on, which tends to get very polarized about, essentialist. And it kind of echoes discussions about engaging men and boys, that, can we only talk about engaging men and boys as in positive terms in order not to turn men off? I mean, it's a different problem, but in politics we get are women better leaders because they're nicer people, or they're more caring? And to what extent do we need to kind of debunk those myths on both sides all the time? And draw attention to the Priti Patels of our Home Office, for example, who is pushing some of the most repressive policies you can imagine, including shutting down civic space. Sorry, so that was my little 2 pence. But Tessa, and then maybe I'd love to hear from Laura about because you had some good answers to that yesterday, I think, on French television. But Tessa, do you want to have a go or respond to Eamon?
I mean, more in response to Eamon, really, which was, and also in response to Andrea's point about gender critical feminists, and what we're hearing from our colleagues in Lebanon, who were kind of rejecting the framing of patriarchy as useful in their context and pushing for the use of heteropatriarchy because of the kind of anti-queer politics within the feminist movement, and as a kind of very necessary kind of queering and intersectionalizing of the anti-backlash movement, which I thought was a very useful kind of intervention on their part. So yeah, just I guess to agree with what you were saying, Eamon, and yeah, just thinking about heteropatriarchy, maybe more patriarchy. But. Yeah,
that's an interesting point about. Because one thing is to challenge the individualistic focus of changing individual men and women, perhaps, to looking at patriarchy in more structural terms. But then you also realize that we have intersectionality, we have sexuality and class and all of the other forms of oppression. And patriarchy is never just gendered; it's always racialized, sexualized, and elitist, and so on. Well, I mentioned your name, hopefully not in vain, Laura, but did you have any reflections on some of the things that Eamon was saying or I was saying in relation to the kind of the polarization of women and men in these debates, whether it's engaging men and boys or women's leadership?
I mean, what I was saying about women's leadership, I mean, it's a kind of a relevant topic for us at the moment because CSW is focusing on women's leadership as we speak. And, you know, I mean, I think women are kind of grossly underrepresented at all levels of, you know, decision-making, you know, in all or most societies. I think there were 22 women heads of state, but there has been this whole debate around, you know, do women make better leaders in the COVID response? Are they more kind of empathetic and better communicators and all of that stuff? I mean, I think there's a few researchers that have kind of just debunked it in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of selection bias. That, you know, the countries that tend to be led by women also tend to be the ones that have a greater, you know, capacity. You know, the higher income countries often, and they have a greater capacity to respond. But I think what I was saying in that interview was, you know, this idea that, you know, in order to have, you know, feminist policy change, you need feminists at kind of every level of decision making, and, you know, the kind of link. What we know is the linkages between women in politics and women in the grassroots and in civil society is so critical in terms of, you know, those accountability relationships and ensuring that, you know, those women are kind of held true, if you like, and that they're hearing the voices of women at the grassroots and what their kind of needs are and so on. So yeah, I think I was just arguing for women everywhere, feminists everywhere, I should say, women and men who are feminists everywhere. But yeah, I mean, I think there's also something really interesting around, you know, sort of reflecting on, you know, Andrea's point and Tessa's point about, you know, the way in which, you know, feminists have been kind of split on some of these issues as well, and how, you know, some kind of elements of feminist organization or feminist thinking, you know, has been, you know, co-opted as well. And I wonder if that's going to be a focus of the Backlash program as well.
Thank you, Laura. And mentioning the theme of International Women's Day around women's leadership, it reminds me that there's this other theme going around, Choose to Challenge, which was, there was a comment made by Michael Flood on Men Engage listserv that it's a private company, and that, I mean, I suppose the question there is this kind of focus on individuals and individual behaviors and characteristics. How helpful is this in terms of looking at heteropatriarchal, elitist oppression in broader terms? But yeah, let's see. Are there any other thoughts from the audience in particular? Perhaps Men Engage members, perhaps anyone from the audience who has any reflections or questions from the speakers? Okay. Otherwise, anyone from the panel want to reflect on others? By the way, this for the audience, you would need to raise your hand on the participants side. I think it is the function under participants. Well, any reflections from speakers? Tessa, Sudarshana, Lena?
No, I'm just thinking about this. Sudarsana, I wonder, I was just thinking about the Jirka, your response to kind of heteropatriarchy rather than patriarchy, and I'm not sure that I agree, and I thought it would be an interesting thing to discuss just because of the way that the gender backlash has played out is very much about attacking gender as a construct, right? And therefore I'm not sure whether all intersectional hierarchies are as relevant, and whether you should separate heterosexism and patriarchy. And I think, yeah, I know one can't talk about, or why some people do talk about hierarchies of intersectionality and oppressions but I was just wondering, I was wondering how other colleagues felt about that, because I feel, it's something quite interesting. I feel quite strongly about it. But Sudarsana, I was wondering what you thought about that, because we've had some conversations about this within our strand.
On looking at heteropatriarchy or kind of trying to make it even more granular and trying to have it layered and saying that.
And maybe I was misinterpreting that, Yoko, but I thought that you were pushing back against talking about heteropatriarchy and saying, well, there's so many other.
Absolutely not. Let me clarify. So, no, I didn't mean to do that at all. Okay. But I also wanted to recognize that sexuality and gender are not the only structures of oppression that matter here. And I'm quite interested in ethno-nationalism, for example, and racism. So patriarchy is always racialized. So in whatever context you take India or you take Sweden or the UK, in the US, it's white patriarchal ideals grounded in a kind of usually a masculinized supremacy, which has a racial flavor as well as a heterosexual, heteronormative. And particularly in ethno-nationalism, you find an othering of, Muslims in India, perhaps, or immigrants in Sweden or the UK, where both ideals of gender and sexuality of the other groups becomes problematized. And perhaps sexuality is central. And I do agree that you can't understand patriarchy without seeing it as a heteropatriarchy. It's kind of inherent in, at least, certainly inherent to hegemonic masculinities. So I agree with you. It's just that I'm pushing us to also see it broader in terms of this elitist structure or this hierarchical structure of supremacy and oppression is embedded in material reality. So, economic elitism is part of it, and racism is part of it. It doesn't mean to say it's more complex. It takes more complex forms, perhaps. But I didn't mean to say that heteropatriarchy was. I did want to challenge you in so far as broadening the perspective a little bit, but not say that it wasn't essential. If that helps. Sorry, I sound defensive. I don't mean to.
No, you don't.
You wanted to come in.
Yeah, no, I just wonder, we've had these discussions, to what extent, if one broadens the lens of how, and this goes back possibly to the kind of everyday versus episodic argument in some ways, but if you broaden the backlash lens, at what point does the object of your analysis as gender disappear, really? And is there a danger of that? I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about this. Laura, I don't know if that's something you've thought about or discussed, or Sudarsana.
At this point, we've had this discussion, right, and particularly for India, to kind of, if we don't how do we look at this without situating it in the broader context in a way, right? Especially in the context of India, where you have histories of caste oppression, right, or anti-Muslim bias, right, and so Brahminical patriarchy, for example, right, and therefore a lot of that kind of then feeds into your concepts of moral policing, right, in terms of puritanism. A lot of that kind of becomes much more, and often vicious in that sense, right? So if you don't extend that lens, it becomes very difficult to situate ourselves and kind of talk about what kind of, and also to that question, I think Russ had about who is actually countering the backlash, who's it against? Who's it against, right? To then kind of think about that as well, right? I think Russ had had that very interesting kind of comment. When we think about backlash, we can't always conceptualize it in terms of the oppressors, but also who's getting oppressed, and therefore you have to think about all these different groups and communities that are getting oppressed. So that actually has to be sort of, I'm just thinking aloud. I mean, you really have, at this point, it's almost also these lines of oppression are coming together, right, in a way. And that's what I think has intensified it, right? So how do we make that sharper without kind of saying, oh, this is an everyday experience of sexism and misogyny, is something that I think we'll have to grapple with in our research.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Sudarshana. I know, Lena, did you want to come in on an earlier point?
Yeah, I just wanted to have a comment on the engaging men and boys, and I think it was very interesting also what you said about having individual approaches that we should go beyond. And I think actually we need both working with individual men, but at the same time look at both of the structural and the political level. Because if you look at the very practical level, how do you engage men in the local communities, then the individual approach, of course, and where you also need role models, but without sort of overpraising men for what they should do anyway. So I think the dual approach is still necessary.
Okay, thanks. Very good points. So we are out of time. There's been an incredibly rich discussion, I feel, and we've got some approvals from the audience as well in the chat line. Very complex discussion, of course. How do we keep a focus on gender inequity and heteropatriarchy without going too broad? How do we define backlash without losing sight of the fact that it's focused on something that they all seem to be fighting for family values, they all seem to be against certain things, and so on. Questions that we're not going to be able to fully answer here today. But before we sign off, does anybody want to have a last word? Tessa, did you want to come back on now? Okay.
No, I just maybe just to say, sorry, Laura, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I just think there are so many interesting different strands here that would be so useful for, feminists like myself sitting in these kind of global policy spaces to really understand. And I was really struck when, I read the paper that we commissioned for the Central and Eastern Europe region about, the different sort of mechanisms and approaches of backlash. And they resonated so strongly with what we were trying to sort of deal with in the global sphere. And I think sort of many of the issues that have come up here around, the reframing, the issue capture, the discourse stuff, and the affect stuff that Chloe raised. So just to say really that I think, sort of going between the sort of the national and the global, I think is going to be quite interesting. And I guess regional is another space again. And thinking about how those interact and intersect, I think is going to be really interesting. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how it all develops.
Great. Thanks. There's so many discussions to take forward here. And of course, many of us are connected, so we will continue to have those discussions. There are other networks and groups like Kvinna to Kvinna was mentioned by Lena. I'm actually having a meeting with them next week. And it's important that we connect across the different groups who are working on this. And the Men Engaged Alliance hosting the symposium is an amazing opportunity. And I'd like to thank the Alliance for that.